Well, I think that let's start topical and then go deeper. I
Yeah.
think that um, over the last couple of weeks, everybody has seen the dust up between um, uh, Trump and Vance and Pope Leo. And uh, while I haven't seen all the coverage of it, I found a lot of it really reflecting a basic ignorance about pretty much everything around the roles that Pope plays, as well as who takes that seriously, who doesn't, and so forth. And then, sort of related, you can either do these as separate questions or combine the extent to which um, the AI generated
Oh,
Trumpist
yeah.
music um, was processed by evangelicals, which I think it was like the first, I think, was a direct offense to Catholics, the second to more the evangelical and Protestant faith.
Yeah. Well, the first thing
Oh,
it brought to my mind was actually a previous AI generated thing that Trump retweeted a year ago in the wake of Pope Francis's death. Right? So remember, Pope Francis died on Easter Sunday a year ago. And as the Catholic Church is grieving the loss of their leader and in the process of selecting a new leader, a person in the media asked Trump if he had an opinion about who should be the next pope. And of course, he said, "Well, what about me?" And then
right.
retweeted and then put on True Social an image of him in the papal vestments. This is like in the middle of the Catholic Church, kind of dealing with the death of Pope Francis. So that immediately brought that back to mind, which was almost exactly a year ago, right after Easter last year. So, and then right after Easter this year, we have this, kind of 1-2 punch from Trump, and Vance playing a supporting role in the background, also tangling with the Pope. Don't forget, actually lecturing the Pope and telling him he should be careful in matters of theology of all things. So, I guess what I think,
Can I stop you there for 1 second?
yeah,
Because one thing that I don't think anyone would think that I was raised Catholic, but I think that one of the things that from following your work, but also really doing a lot of research into it. I think one of the things that, and correct me if I don't say this exactly right, that people don't understand about papal infallibility is that really refers only to dogma. And like it isn't the idea that anything the Pope said is infallible, but that the thing that what's associated with Catholic dogma, he's taken as infallible, and that contrary to some of the pushback that I've seen, where people will think they're like smart alecky and showing different popes disagreeing with each other, that it's not about dogma. And that whether it's the most conservative or liberal pope, however you define that, they all agree pretty much all the time on that. And that this particular comment was something that was not just hot take from the Vatican.
no, I think that's right. I mean, that doctrine only applies when he's speaking in his official capacity and on Catholic doctrine, and it's usually very formal, right? It's like written document. It's a very formal decree, those kinds of things. So, these comments, here and what Pope Leo is doing, I think, is actually, not speaking kind of in an infallible way and on Catholic theology, but he is speaking as a kind of moral leader
Right.
in the world, right? And what's interesting is that you've got the head of the Anglican Church, right? Actually, who've had a lot of tension between those two historically, but saying, "Yeah, no, I stand with the Pope on this one, on the matter of the war." And what's interesting about this, though, is that Pope Leo is not just shooting off, kind of firing off comments off the cuff. He actually is speaking. He himself is an Augustinian, all right, and that comes out of the just war tradition in Catholic theology. Actually comes from Saint Augustine. So this, if there's anything sort of he knows well, it is this Augustinian theological tradition. So like on war is fairly simple, actually, right? That on a war, for example, one of the reasons he's been able to speak so plainly on this is because in the Catholic just war tradition, there is no such thing as a war of choice that is moral, right? By definition, war has to be a last resort after all things have failed. So it doesn't even get off the ground as a moral discussion. It doesn't even meet the threshold conditions of a just war. So that's one of the reasons why he and other Catholic bishops in the U.S. also have been able to be very clear on this, that, you really cannot have a war of choice and call it a just war. And so, it's pretty straightforward from that position. But here's the thing: is that I think that I'm not sure Trump himself understands the risk he may be running with American Catholics on this front. Pope Leo is actually fairly popular. He is an American pope, right? A familiar figure to many Catholics, and also just to say, like, he doesn't have a lock on the Catholic vote in the way that he has, for example, among white evangelical voters who have voted more than 80% for him every time he has been on the ballot. But the Catholic vote is much more up for grabs than that. In fact, there's a big split within the Catholic vote between Latino and white Catholics. So white Catholics have also supported him, but only about 60% every time he's been on the ballot. Latino Catholics have supported his opponents, his Democratic opponents, every time he's been on the ballot. And depending on where you are in the country, for example, if you're in Texas or California, Latino Catholics outnumber white Catholics by about 4-1. All right. And in the country as a whole, it's really only a little more than 55-45 white to non-white Catholics in the country today. So that split, that racial and ethnic divide that runs along political lines is really important. And notably, again, they're not a locked in constituency the way that white evangelicals are. And I guess the last thing I'll say on this front is that they're also in swing states and places where elections are won and lost in a way that evangelicals also are not. They're heavily packed into kind of red states and red districts. But Catholics are in exactly the places where elections are going to be decided, both in the midterms and the next presidential election.
Right. And in any of I have your polling, either back when you did the other thing or now, or what you've seen, what's your sense of the impact it's having on his Catholic supporters?
Yeah, well, we don't have data quite. It's all happened too quickly to have good data back on it yet. Usually these things take a little time to settle anyway. But here's what we do know is that even before the war in Iran that led to this dust up, he was already in shakier territory with Catholics than he was, at the last election. So even among white Catholics that he won, 62%, he was barely in positive territory in terms of favorability. He was only at 53%. But the real kicker for me is that, and this is polling in February, that our numbers among Latino Catholics, his favorability has fallen to 25% among Latino Catholics. And it was at 37% in the 2024 election. So it's down 12 points, even from a low of 37. It's gone down to 25. And this is before the war in Iran. Right. An Ipsos poll a couple of weeks ago weighed in. He's underwater with white Catholics. Only 46% of white Catholics support the war. Only 33% of non-white Catholics support the war in Iran. And supermajorities say that he should end the war, even if the goals aren't met. So he's in very shaky territory. You combine that with the economy as well, and the negative reaction, particularly among Latino Catholics, to this immigration, violent ICE attacks and immigration crackdown. Again, if I'm a Republican strategist, I'm not looking very comfortably at these numbers.
Right. That's right. And now what about, you started with the image of Trump as Jesus. How are folks in the evangelical community processing that?
Well, this is what's interesting is that, we have tracked Trump's favorability numbers like from 2015 before he even became the nominee. And ever since he's become the nominee, it has been unshakable. It has been like basically 7 and 10 white evangelicals, no matter what scandal, no matter what controversy, it has just been fairly rock steady. And again, we don't have the numbers to see if there's a dip yet because this last thing, but we do see on social media from members of his own party, people using words like blasphemy to describe what he did on Truth Social, right? Depicting himself as Jesus. And I think people, he got back on and said, "Oh, I thought it was a picture of this doctor," right? Nobody bought that.
Right,
Even people in his own circles were not willing to kind of help him spin that particular narrative. So, when you've got Marjorie Taylor Greene, you've got Tucker Carlson calling him the Antichrist. We're in different territory now. I think it did resonate. Now, whether or not those people would turn around and behave differently at the ballot box, like,
right,
I don't know. But it is a remarkably rare instance where something he did on the front of religion actually offended his own followers. And I think it's just because Trump really doesn't have his own sense of even what religious piety means, I think, right? So he has no inner guardrails where he could even anticipate that this might be offensive. He only finds out once he does it and then tries to kind of, backpedal out of it.
yeah. Um, and I think, um, uh, sorry, just had the question in my head and then it flew away.
You're envisioning that
Oh, I know,
picture
yeah, yeah, yeah.
of
But
Trump with his glowing hand.
one really big thing that I find, like, most people who, like, try to really keep up with things and try to read in the media and all that, have no idea how large Christian media is in this country
Mm.
in terms of radio and in particular, and also cable and satellite, all that. So if you'd say a few words just to give people a sense of, like, this big information ecosystem that a lot of these voters live in, that no one ever pays attention to or talks about, and whether at this point you have a sense of whether those evangelical preachers who run those shows, how are they reacting to it?
Yeah. Well, I mean it is a kind of hermetically sealed, a bubble that Christian radio has radio particularly has created. So Salem Radio network, particularly rural areas all over the South. Yeah, it is a place where you would get kind of the same thing from that. Then you would get kind of a newsletter. It's a kind of ecosystem. And it used to be like, I mean, James Dobson was kind of the archetype of the old version of this. And, at one time, for example, I think people don't know, he was running out of Colorado Springs. He was sending so much direct mail out that he had his own zip code in Colorado Springs. He had a bigger weekly readership than the New York Times. He had a bigger radio audience than NPR. I mean, this is the kind of thing. It's now so much more fragmented than that. But if you put together, the podcast, the radio networks, the cable Trinity Broadcasting Network, EWTN, which is the Catholic kind of version of that. I mean, it's a sizable reach, and it is a place where if you listen to one, you tune in to the other. So it is a kind of echo chamber that's out there. So, but I will say that there have been folks even in those worlds, kind of ish that were the Pope thing, not so much. That didn't break
Right.
through. But the Jesus thing, him depicting himself as Jesus, and I think once you get people like Tucker Carlson, um, uh, you know, breaking ranks, it gives permission for other people to kind of express their own kinds of concerns there. Now you still see people like saying, "Well, you can still support his policies while being disturbed about this behavior." You'll see that kind of things. People kind of, trying to kind of say, "Well, you don't really have to abandon the MAGA movement just because you're disturbed." So they're trying to kind of draw lines, but we should just note that's a pretty defensive posture that is a rare thing in MAGA land.
Got it.
Yeah.
And you were also mentioning earlier about, Hispanic Catholics
Yeah.
and, way in which, they've been are, like, mobilized against, really heinous deportation and kidnapping practices of Trump's regime. Um, can you comment at all sort of how not the voters, but the, leaders, in that area behaved ahead of the election, even when it was obvious this was coming, w
Yeah.
how they're behaving now.
Yeah, I think, what's interesting is that I mean, the the image that's coming to mind is crickets.
Yeah,
That mostly what we heard was nothing, from, Catholic leadership ahead of the election. It was very quiet, not a lot of criticism and as you said, I mean, it was being broadcast. He was talking about, and I will just say to you, Mike, I really appreciate you writing a piece a few weeks ago about, I think you called it, "Let's call them
yeah,
concentration camps what they are," because he was talking about this on the
right,
campaign trail. I mean, this was not some surprise he unveiled after he got elected. And yet, even with, yeah, the Catholic Church with more than 40% of its constituency kind of Latino or Hispanic background, not much word of concern from the Catholic hierarchy here in the US. I think it's been the war that's actually opened up a different front. And I think just seeing how violent and really lawless those ICE agents have been in places like Minneapolis that has, I think, made people speak up a bit more there. But it's remarkable too that the other, and I would say this too about the importance of religion. There's all kinds of, as you know, uh, energy and analysis and money spent on trying to understand the Latino vote, right? And because it's more mobile, it moves more. It's not as locked down as many white groups are, for example. But almost never in kind of political analysis do you really see this religious lens being brought. And it's one of the biggest fault lines in the Latino community between Latino Protestants, which are tend to be more evangelical and charismatic, who have voted about 6 and 10 for Trump, and Latino Catholics who voted 6 and 10 against
right.
Trump. And that fault line is just huge and perpetual, and it's very little attention paid to it. But I will say this: even among Latino Protestants who voted for Trump. Again, pretty much every time he's been on the ballot, we have seen. I mean, his favorability among Latino Protestants was 51% around the election, and it's down to 37
Wow.
percent. So
Yeah,
even that group that's leaned into him are way down here, and largely it's some over the economy, but it's largely over just the sheer violence that's been unleashed toward their community with this mass immigration crack, and very straightforwardly against black and brown people.
that's right, that's right. Now, the next thing I wanna ask you about, um, is Opus Dei, and, which I think, unfortunately, for a lot of people, um, uh, who really don't understand what that is and, who they are, what they're doing, the like, anyone who sort of talks about the influence they've had in American politics, um, tends to get dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. In part, I think because of like Dan Brown books and stuff like that. Um, but it's a pretty serious thing. And I think it's worth sort of your setting the like telling the real story about it and sort of the extent to which, while not um like very many adherents in the United States, the ones that are in positions of enormous power.
Sure, I could talk a little bit about that. It's not my biggest area of
Yeah.
expertise, but it's essentially a very conservative kind of right movement inside the Catholic Church that's been organized. It was organized, like 100 years ago, and it's a very old organization. But it has become, I think, kind of wrapped up in very conservative right wing politics. With a fair amount of wealth behind it and influence behind it as well. So I think like that's the other the other like Knights of Columbus is another group inside the U.S. That is kind of organized for on the right, but Opus Dei is kind of further on the right. It's interesting that Pope Francis had a kind of mixed relationship with them, and actually had some affirming things to say about them. But I think inside the Catholic Church, there's been a lot of alarm raised about, as you said, there's some kind of pop culture stuff around the Da Vinci Code and other kinds of books like that. But about just the kind of back end influence through money, influence, and power that it's asserting in the U.S.
Yeah. I think Regina and I think a couple other people mentioned a really important book about it by Gareth Gore,
Mm,
who was a finance reporter for business publication who got interested in a small financial story about the Vatican and started pulling on the thread. And it's a really
mm,
remarkable book for you to read. And it gets at so, and I think what, and here I'm not, I don't know for sure. It's a pretty secretive thing. So I'm not sure that what I'm about to say is these people are literally in it, but they're definitely swimming around it. Um, Definitely, Leonard Leo, is very much the, like, recruiter inside the United States for this and spends a lot of time with Catholics. It's a lot to do with Vance's conversion. And you have folks on the Supreme Court who, like, are very much, if not card carrying, very much in that circle. And as you said, I think that that it had a privileged place inside the Vatican hierarchy that has been chipped away at in the last two, whatever two popes have been concerned about, like just how much power had been given over to them. So it's a interesting thing if people want to know more. Another area where I think the white Christian nationalism is not fully appreciated is the extent
mm.
to which it had already and now is being advanced. Uh, they have adherents inside the military and law enforcement, and that I think, and get interested in your opinion back, but I think like under cover of anti-DEI, the a deeper agenda going on with the different stories you've heard about people who've been passed over for promotion is about changing the balance between folks like Mark Milley, who were not in that camp at all, and were willing to stand up to Trump and such, and more who come out of the Michael Flynn wing of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's super important. I mean, there's no, the other, because the other person in this drama that we were already talking about in this kind of April, Easter dust up, it was certainly President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. But the other character that was right front and center was Pete Hegseth at Department of Defense. And, if there is a kind of clear case for someone who is just mainstreaming white Christian nationalism into the federal government. It was probably Russell Vogt, but also Pete Hegseth, the Department of Defense. I mean, he has had, well, first of all, he set up a set of worship services that he's holding under the official auspices of Department of Defense, and he is bringing in people like Doug Wilson, right? Who's a pastor in his own denomination, who's a self-avowed not only Christian nationalist, but a self-avowed paleo Confederate that he calls himself, and that's who he has brought to preach at a worship service in the Pentagon. Hegseth himself has got he wrote a book called American Crusade. For example, he has crusader tattoos all over his body. He's got like a sword and the word Deus Vult, which is God wills it, which is what the Crusaders were chanting as they were killing Muslims in the Middle Ages, right? This is the script from which he is understanding world politics. And so all these purges inside, disproportionately women, disproportionately people of color. And he's also stripped the JAG, inside the judge advocate generals, inside the Pentagon and the armed forces. this is all about streamlining it and getting rid of any guardrails, right? That would be about him just casting all these conflicts literally as a holy war between kind of the West, right? And there's the whiteness always hides under words like the West or Western civilization. Like that's the stand-in for whiteness, European descent. But this kind of Western civilization versus the God, the Muslims, on the other hand, is that is literally the frame through which he sees, most foreign policy. And this is the man with, his running the entire armed forces.
It's truly terrifying. And if folks hadn't, like, missed kind of missed that he also channeled from the Church of Quentin Tarantino, um, when
Yeah.
he recited as coming from Ezekiel, the Samuel L. Jackson refrain, um, in Pulp Fiction.
The
Um,
book of Pulp Fiction, that's right, instead
that
of the book of Ezekiel, yeah,
that's just how truly devout, um, Hegseth is.
yeah.
Um,
It's consistent with how I mean, even if he were using a text from the Bible, he'd be ripping it from the page and just marshaling it for his own interest, like, there's no deeper devotional sense, and like I said, I mean, they're running roughshod over, um, nearly 2,000 years of Catholic and Christian moral teaching about what's a just war. Like, so if they were serious about theology and really wanted to engage
right.
Christian theology, like there's plenty of them to engage with, but they'd rather just like cherry pick Bible verses and, posture with their tattoos and, yell about killing Muslims.
Yeah. I wanna lift up a really, great thing in the chat from someone. I am a Desert Storm veteran USN. I wanna let everyone know that no mercy, no quarter is blasphemy to service members. And I think it's really just important for folks to understand just how many standard deviations away from what we used to think of as the most warmongering expressions out of the Pentagon that
Yeah.
where he is.
But, if you set up the world where we are on the side of God and the good, and anyone you decide your enemy is on the side of the
Right.
devil and evil, then
Yeah.
giving no quarter starts to make sense, right? It really is a war of genocidal intent, and it is an abomination and apostasy from a Christian standpoint. It's also a war crime,
Right.
from the stance of international law.
Yeah. It yeah. So change it, folks, a little bit. The, um you've already laid out just how consolidated the white evangelical vote has been behind not just Trump, but basically all Republican candidates for quite a while. And in one of my Substacks that you helped a bunch with, where I talked about the way in which the House majority has really become a white Christian nationalist majority, because almost all of the people who are serving in the Republican caucus come from districts that have substantial white evangelical populations, and that the basically all of the most white evangelical districts elect Republicans. And something that I've done, if someone can throw that one in there, but something that I haven't published yet, but I think is also real, that takes that a step further, is, thanks to your data, being able to look at the percentage of Republican primary voters in
Mm.
2024 in different parts of the country. And one of the things that jumps out is that in the basically in the red states, in the neo-Confederacy, white evangelicals by themselves make up a little over 50% of everyone who voted in Republican primaries in 2024. So you have a group that is organized through the churches and all of the networks that like if you are a candidate and have 80-20 behind you with 50% or more with 50%, you own those districts, right? And when you focus it more on rural, when you add that rural layer and evangelical, then it goes up to almost two-thirds of the voters. And so one of the things that I think would be helpful, because this is like from sort of where you come from, is for people to understand in a more vivid, not data-rich way,
Mm,
just the way in which life in like rural Southern
mhm.
communities are so organized around their church life that even before you get to that kind of data, you just can't run for Congress or state legislature there if you aren't supported by that community, right?
Yeah.
Because I think people think too much in this sort of abstract way of, well, who should we run in this district? Or like, what's the strategy? And don't understand what it's like on the ground living in that kind of place.
Yeah, well, my, family still, lives in Jackson and around Jackson, Mississippi, so I kinda go back there, and I am, a couple times a year, and I am struck by, even in a place like Jackson, which is not rural, but if I get out to the Delta or Southern Mississippi where it's more rural, this is even more pronounced. But all the things that we talk about in terms of national trends, like, it's still true that it's nearly two-thirds of the country that supports same-sex marriage, nearly two-thirds of the country that supports abortion rights. Six more than 6 in 10 support allowing undocumented immigrants a path to citizenship. All of that stuff is still true at the national level. But when you get down in these little bubbles, particularly in the deep South, that when I say that to people down there, they're like, no, that can't be true, right? Because
Right.
that's not the world they live in, right? And you can feel it. You can really feel a difference there. It's so homogeneous, and I think that's one of the really challenging things is that nationwide, just to put those numbers you gave in perspective, those numbers have been shrinking, right? So white evangelicals in the country now, 30 years ago, they were a quarter of the country, like nationwide. They're now only 13% of the country. But in these rural southern places, that is not true. And especially if you're looking at things like low turnout primaries, where they are organized and they turn out in disproportionate numbers. So even that they're more numerous, but they multiply that by the high turnout numbers, and that they pile themselves so much on one side of the political spectrum, right? So you got 85% piling on one side. They turn out at higher levels than their neighbors do, and then you end up with this really weird disproportionate, yeah, where you can hit 50% or 60%,
Right.
of a particular election, and add in gerrymandered districts, and it all adds up to these very challenging things at the local level, particularly if you're talking about like congressional district, yeah, level.
Right, absolutely, and I think to, like, put a, like, half tongue in cheek point on it, it's like many of these are the districts that Democrats used to win, and the problem isn't, like, coming up with the right message for a Democratic candidate there, right? This is, like, in the roots, and and I think people have to understand just what that challenge is, right? And that I don't see any of the strategic conversations even acknowledging it. Sort of gets to another point, which hopefully, if you've been, even if this is your first exposure to Robby and this data, I hope you're wondering, like, why don't I see that in any story about politics ever? Right? The data is there. People respect the work PROI does highly. And on top of that, although not with as much frequency and not with as much um, depth and nuance, Pew Research has been trying to focus on religion in America
Mm.
for quite some time, and their data is completely in sync with what Robby comes up with. And yet, no one talks about it. How many times were you flipped out by a New York Times Siena survey in 23, 24, and there was never a single word about it, right? And to be clear, those surveys, and not just them, but it's like pick any of the others, the surveys do ask what your religious affiliation is. So it's not as if the people who decide to write about it can't know it within their own surveys, but they publish banners, it's not included. They talk about it, they don't include it. They talk about, say, white non-college voters. They don't bother to break it out into those who are evangelical. And I'm sure, like, you must have a lot of lumps on your head, banging it against the wall, trying to figure
Yeah.
out why it doesn't break through. So it'd be great to hear sort of your thoughts about that.
Well, yeah. I mean, I share my frustration. I like the image of banging my head against the wall or shouting into the void or,
Yeah,
whatever
right.
metaphor you wanna, bring. But yeah, I mean, we're there, like, the data is there. The data is very, very clear. Just take the threat of Christian nationalism in the country, right? We've been measuring this. Well, first of all, there's a decade of social science and political science, peer review, published research, all showing basically the same thing. We've built on that tradition. Last 4 years, we have published every year, not just like a national survey, but like we've got over 20,000 interviews where we can actually get every state and look at the threat of Christian nationalism in every state. Um, and yet, that coverage doesn't really break through. It explains so much of our politics, right? If you just know, for example, like I often will trot this out that, our two political parties, part of the reason things are so intractable is that they've sorted themselves along racial and religious lines. It's not just political
Right,
ideology, right? So Republicans today are nearly 70% white and Christian, right? That party. So no wonder it's become the party of white Christian nationalism, right? So it's 70% white and Christian. The country itself is only 40% white and Christian. So kind of let that sink in for a minute, how out of sync that is. And when we look at Christian nationalist measures, it's now a solid majority of Republicans that qualify as Christian nationalists, according to our data and other data as well. On the other side, Democrats are only 25% white and Christian, right? So you've got this kind of race, religion, party, all kind of pulling in the same direction. That just explains like so much of what we're looking at. And if we're looking at the attacks on democracy and the thing that holds together, really the big picture of what's happening, whether it's Trump or Hegseth or the purging of the civil service, firing of top level people, it is bending the kind of leadership toward white Christian male people. Right, is a clear vision. It's not mysterious, but if you kind of understand that, oh well, that's the worldview. These actions are not one offs; they're actually implementing a very broad vision. Russell Vogt, right, one of the key architects of Project 2025, very clearly, a supporter of this Christian nationalist worldview as well. And it's so obvious on the pages of Project 2025, and yet not that many people wrote about Project 2025 as a Christian nationalist, blueprint or document. I'll say one more thing is that we've actually had the kind of two top level religion reporters at the New York Times essentially saying we're not going to use the term Christian nationalism because they think it's a made up term by academics. And I was like, well, how are you going to understand the kind of biggest force shaping the MAGA world if you're going to ignore the best social scientific research in the country? But
right,
that's part of where we're at. Yeah.
right. No, I think I mean, have really banged my head against the wall on this and have talked to many of the people who report on this. And it's the same experience every time, which is they'll agree, but it never shows up. Right. And it's really like just so remarkable that the extent to which the sort of closed mind, hive mind, right? Um, and I have a like optimistic hope that if anyone with credibility pierced it, a lot of other reporters and public analysts would be ready to rush in.
Yeah.
But I think forever wrong reasons, it's seen if you talk about religion, it's kind of a third rail that that you're going to get a lot of backlash from people who like organized religion, right? And just a whole plus, I think for many people who have, as you said, that led in terms of where people are in the country, it's like, you're talking about how in Mississippi, and you tell them that this percentage of people favor um, marriage equality or whatever it is, and they say that can't possibly be true. I think, unfortunately, if you go around the newsrooms of most of the major media outlets and said, "Did you know that like 90% of people in this place believe blah 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 blah?" They just don't believe it either,
Mm. Yeah.
right? Because they've lived, and I think this has been the case more and more in the last couple decades when elite media draws almost everyone from Ivy League schools or other kind of backgrounds, that very few of them have lived in the South, um, or like have
Yeah.
cared to be curious about it.
I think there may actually be a different problem too, is that,
Yeah.
there's actually, at least in the religion reporter world, there's a fair amount of them who did come out of the evangelical world,
Yeah.
and I think don't wanna believe the worst of that world, or don't wanna sort of face, I think, the real, because for me, because we saw this with Hegseth's confirmation hearing. There was no one on the Democratic side of the aisle willing to talk about his extremist religious views, because they,
Yeah.
understandably want to be, we don't have no religion test for office. That's all true. Um, but when you have someone who holds a set of extremist views, whatever their roots, who's going to be confirmed at that level, you got to be able to say, like, is this a threat to democracy or not, whatever its source, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's the thing that people are missing, is that, look, we know that religion does a lot of really amazing, fantastic things that hold up our civil societies. They create hospitals, soup kitchens, take care of the poor. All of that stuff is absolutely true. But we are also at a moment where we are facing a politicized group that has hijacked a version of that religion, and is out to undermine democracy. And if we're not clear eyed about that, it is absolutely going to prevent us from really holding our pluralistic democracy together and protecting it for the next generation.
Yeah. I Not to give them a pass, but I can see why religious reporters would be more cautious about it because for the other, 364 day or whatever, they they're their sources and like they're embedded in those communities. So I think it could be a little more intimidating to just go all out in the way you're talking about. I was talking more about people who are covering
Yeah.
politics
Yeah.
for right, where I think it's much more important to get it into the story because so many people rely on that narration to understand the world we're living in, as opposed to a story that's marked, this is about religion, right? That we need that component of this is about politics. And, for me, on the one hand, I like grew up in the Northeast where did not run into many white evangelicals or what we're talking about. But like having done politics for like 40 years and doing campaigns in the South and actually having lived in Florida for a couple of years, like once you experience it, then like it's real. It's what Robbie's saying. And it's really pretty, I don't know what the right word is, but just like really derelict that all of our commentators and reporters don't feel any obligation to be curious, even to go out and look at it or try to understand it.
Yeah, I'm glad you used the word curious. I think that's right. A kind of curiosity, because that implies, that you don't already know everything.
Right.
There might be something to learn. And then I think, and that you're open to seeing not just, the good, not just the bad, but, it's always some kind of mix here. I think that's like super, super important. in this, and particularly in this moment. But I think you're right about the political reporters. But to say, like, look, you cannot understand the Latino vote without understanding religion, right? You can't understand this entanglement with the Pope over war without understanding religion. You can't understand the MAGA movement, the thing that is like ripping the
Right.
world apart without understanding Christian nationalism, right? And its hold that it has on the sort of the deep followers, particularly white evangelicals in this country.
Yeah. So probably last topic to open up. Over the last, at least 10 years, the Roberts Court has been basically trying to make Christianity great again.
Mm,
And if you do a little overview of just how much of a U turn they have made on the like 240 years of understanding of the separation of church and state, which is one of the most successful parts of our constitutional order.
yeah. Well, I think what we've seen over time, and it's funny. I mean, I can trace this actually with the way. So I grew up Southern Baptist, right in Mississippi, with actually the journey that Southern Baptists have taken on this. So Southern Baptists historically, because we were a minority religion historically, for example, my ancestors in Virginia who were Baptists couldn't open up a church, right? Because Baptist was not the official sanctioned religion in the Virginia colonies. But so we were for religious liberty when it applied to us. And then sort of, as we became, for example, Southern Baptists became the largest expression of Protestant Christianity by the middle of the 20th century, suddenly that began to slip. And so I think one way of just explaining it is that religious liberty, whether it is, the right of an individual clerk who's decided to work for the state to say, I'm not going to sign the license of, a same-sex couple because it's against my religion, even though I'm working in this official capacity for the state. Like saying that right trumps the other rights at stake. I think that expansion of this kind of individual religious liberty of Christians to kind of push into the public sphere that right, including right when it involves their operating inside the state and if even in official capacities. And we've seen, the courts, we've seen it in DOD, we've seen it in Trump's White House. So it's not, it's kind of across the board. But I think the courts being more and more willing, I think, to kind of let these individual expression rights trump the kind of separation of church and state rights is probably the through all the kind of machinations and complexity of the law. But I think that when I think about the big picture, that almost weaponization of an individual right, particularly of a kind of white evangelical Christian, to kind of push into public space in a way that is privileged, I think, is what we're really seeing.
Yeah, it really, that just the extent to which that's another thread, and obviously it like leads to Dobbs as well, but the extent to which the like an idea that like for so long, I think was just consensus and like didn't think you could challenge is the idea that you could exempt yourself from anti-discrimination laws by claiming that those laws were discriminating against you for being a racist or a bigot.
Yeah.
It's like that's the right we have to protect is your right to like be like make choices based on race or gender or whatever. It's really an upside down world.
Well, yeah, I should say that, I mean, we should just all remember that there's a myth out there that the religious right or the Christian right began with abortion and same-sex marriage. But like, if you look at the real history, it actually begins with exactly what you're saying. It begins with Bob Jones University trying to insist that they could have a policy that black and white students could not date each other,
Right.
right? A kind of segregationist policy on campus while collecting federal funds, and that should all be okay, right? And they were taken to court and saying, no, 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 actually, you're run afoul of the civil rights laws. But that's the thing that brought Jerry Falwell into the public, was defending the right of Bob Jones University to hold this discriminatory racist policy. That's really the propellant that got the Christian right movement off the ground. They added abortion much later to that thing. So in some ways, it's the thing that got them going, and is still the
Right,
project that's being
right.
pushed forward.
Because again, it's something I don't think people generally understand the extent to which they take advantage of um, tax preferences and basically a lot already. And that was what they were, and at that time also that they were running segregation academies,
Yeah.
right? Um, but I think if you want to really like sort of get to the end, just like how the world is turned upside down, just to be clear, what Robbie was talking about in terms of trying to take away their tax exemption and not getting away with it in court, we're talking about the Richard Nixon IRS and the Berger Court, right? And affirmed by the Rehnquist Court. So, you know, boy, have the goalposts moved on
Yeah.
this, right? I mean, that was how settled it seemed at the time, right? Anyway, we're just about at time. Robbie, anything else you want to get for folks? Jen, be sure to like re-up the pre-order link. It's been really great having you for this conversation, but anything you want to pull together or recommend?
Sure. Well, I'll just invite folks to take a look at the new book. It's called Backslide. Reclaiming a Faith in a Nation After the Christian Turn Against Democracy. For any of you who are in the religious world, you'll recognize that word backslide. It's a theological word about kind of like losing your salvation, a kind of big worry inside of white evangelical circles when I was growing up. But it's also a term that's being used more and more by political scientists today, right, to talk about democratic backsliding. So in the book, I try to weave those two things together. I'll leave it with that teaser. Won't give away too much, but it's available now, audiobook, ebook, wherever books are sold.
Great. Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining in. And I should have said this earlier too. You've also done some great YouTubes after each of your um, survey releases. So do you have actually something you can subscribe to there, or
Yeah. So
we'll just
we're on Substack. So just do PRRI, or Public Religion
we
Research.
got that one in, but I forgot about the YouTube channel. So
Yeah, and we have a
yeah,
YouTube channel, and then I'm on a weekly thing with 3 other historians called the Convocation Unscripted. That's on every week as well. So,
great. All right. Thanks all.
all
See
right,
you Wednesday.
thanks,
Take
Mike.
care. Bye bye.